Hey, 8th grade, how's it going? This is Mr. Gregory. I hope you enjoyed your spring break, even though it was pretty much the same as it's been, I assume, since we left for this quarantine in the first place. My hair's getting a little bit longer. Can't get a haircut. It's the way it is. So, our question or our assignment for this week is something that I've done with Period 2. So if you were in Period 2, you've done this before, slightly, but this time we're just all going to do it. Most of the 8th grade hasn't done it. So this is for everybody to do for our next assignment. The question is, why did the Founding Fathers leave slavery in the Constitution? So if you're in Period 2, you probably think, oh yeah, I did this, I remember this. You're going to end up doing it again, but this time in a much more substantial way than just a little exit slip. For everybody else, for this question, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the Founding Fathers or framers, whatever you want to call them, at the Constitution, what did they say about why they kept slavery, and then what do historians say as to why they kept slavery. Just a little bit of background for you. Thomas Jefferson, as you're going to find out, had a grievance that was in the Declaration of Independence, and he says we should get rid of slavery. How can we say all men are created equal if we have slavery? And so we're going to read that in a moment. Basically, the reason I'm bringing that up is because it was brought up in the Constitution or at the Declaration of Independence. Hey, slavery, do we keep this? And at the Declaration of Independence, the South said, if you get rid of slavery, then we're not going to join you in fighting Great Britain for freedom in the war for independence. We're not going to do it. So the South basically said, no, you get rid of slavery, we're done. So slavery stayed during that time period. The Declaration of Independence doesn't say anything about slavery, even though we're going to read the redacted, that means taken out, the taken out grievance. We're going to read that in just a moment. But then at the Constitutional Convention, they debated, should we get rid of slavery? Like, does it, is it really important to us? And they're going to decide to keep it. And what I want to know is why. Why do you think they did? Some of you have been hearing the question and then just kind of writing what you think without looking at the sources. It's really important that you read the sources along with me and think about what they're saying. Obviously, your opinion's important, but I want your opinion based on what others have said. Do you get what I'm saying? I think that's much more important. So, let's start with a slavery grievance that was in the Declaration of Independence. You can read that along with me now. Thomas Jefferson was born to a slave-owning family, and he himself owned slaves. As chairman of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson wrote a paragraph condemning slavery. That means he's coming out against slavery. In his first draft of the Declaration, he included this paragraph in his list of complaints against King George III. Before the final version of the Declaration was adopted, this paragraph was deleted or redacted. Okay, so let's read the actual grievance. King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself. Now, King George III was the King of England at the time. We were trying to break away from England. So they're saying, hey, the person we're trying to break away from, he's waged war against human nature. He has taken away the most sacred rights of life and liberty from a distant people who never offended him. In other words, saying, he's attacking us when we're so far away and we never did anything to wrong him. He did this by captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere if they did not die a miserable death in their transportation to this new world. So what he's talking about there is he's blaming King George III for what we just did in our last assignment, the Middle Passage. He blames King George III for that. Honestly, that's not fair, but it's interesting that Thomas Jefferson would bring that up. These disgraceful practices are the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain. Notice that he calls him the Christian King of Great Britain, as if to say, oh, this guy's not really a Christian. This guy endorses slavery. What a jerk. Well, okay, but, Thomas Jefferson and the other people at the Constitutional Convention and the ones that signed the Declaration of Independence, they all owned slaves, or at least most of them did, so it's a little hypocritical. He has stopped every attempt to prohibit or restrain the disgusting business of slavery. So what they're saying is, okay, King George hasn't done anything to stop slavery from occurring in the Americas. He's determined to keep an open market where men are bought and sold. I would say, as much as, I'm not personally a fan of King George III, whatever, this is kind of unfair to King George III, because King George III, while, yes, he is the king of these colonies, and he is allowing slavery to exist, that's kind of passing all of the blame onto him, and I don't really think that's fair. Like, King George III didn't force Thomas Jefferson and all the other slave owners to own slaves. So to blame him for that is, in my opinion, nonsense. But that's not what we're here about. We're here to see that Jefferson wrote this into the Declaration of Independence, saying slavery is wrong, and we blame King George III, the King of Great Britain, the King of England. We blame him for it. Okay. Well, it made sense because the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal. Slavery doesn't really fit with that. Okay. Well, that was in 1776. About a decade later, 1787, the Founding Fathers would write the Constitution, which are the laws that govern our nation to this day. So when they're writing the laws that govern this nation, let's see what the people who actually wrote the Constitution had to say. If you go down to where it says Philadelphia Constitutional Convention of 1787, it's on the next page. It says here, the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention was where the Founding Fathers gathered to write the Constitution. They had many debates over what the new government should look like. This is where they decided to keep slavery. If you read the documents below, try to see if they thought slavery was a major contradiction. In other words, something that contradicts something else is something that doesn't fit with it. So, let me try to think of a good contradiction. If I say, hey, you guys should live a life that's free of violence, and then, I push people. That's a contradiction. I say, hey, don't be violent, but then I shove people around or I punch people in the face. That's a contradiction. I can't say I'm anti-violence and then do violent things. So try to see if the Founding Fathers see slavery as a contradiction to this all men are created equal doctrine that they've said. Let's start with Mr. Rutledge. Let's see what he has to say. Mr. Rutledge. Religion and humanity have nothing to do with this question. The true question at present is whether the Southern states shall or shall not be a part of the Union. If the Northern states think about their interest, they will not oppose the increase of slaves because they will profit by selling the goods that slaves produce. Okay, so Rutledge says, slavery has nothing to do with religion or humanity. Right now we need to focus on whether the South is going to be part of the country. When they say the Union, they mean the country, the nation. And Rutledge has a point, not a good one, but his point is, hey, if we get rid of slavery, the South is not going to join us in the new country. So we need the South. Let's keep slavery for that reason. It's more important to have the South on our side. All right. Then he goes on to say, if Northern states think about their interest, they're not going to oppose the increase of slaves because they will profit by selling the goods that slaves produce. In other words, Rutledge is saying, hey, if we get rid of slavery, not only is the South going to leave, but the North, you benefit from slavery because all the cotton, all the sugar, all the raw materials that slaves make in the South or collect in the South then goes to the North and they can make it into things. So sugar becomes molasses, cotton can become clothing or textiles. Basically, Rutledge is saying, hey, the North, you need slavery, or you benefit off of slavery. So it doesn't make sense to end slavery according to Mr. Rutledge. Okay, now I'm not going to tell you what to think. You're smart enough. Look at what Rutledge says. Does he have a point? Is he right? That's up to you. I mean, I can tell you right now, I think slavery is wrong, and I don't think there's a good reason for it at all, but you might have a different opinion, and that's okay. I'm not going to judge you for having a different opinion, but just be aware that that is a defense of slavery, so just be aware of that. Let's go down to Mr. Ellsworth. Let every state do what it pleases. The morality or wisdom of slavery are decisions belonging to the states themselves. What enriches a part enriches the whole. All right, so Mr. Ellsworth is very, very similar to Mr. Rutledge, but he says things a little bit differently. He says what enriches a part enriches the whole, meaning, hey, slavery doesn't just benefit the South, it benefits the North too, so it's all good. So that's a bit like the first part. But what's really interesting is what he says at the beginning. Let every state do what it pleases. The morality of or wisdom of slavery are decisions belonging to the states themselves. So his argument is the Constitution sets up a national government, a federal government. It's not up to that big federal government to make decisions about the individual states. So let me repeat that. This is not a decision to be made by the whole nation. This is a decision to be made by each individual state. So don't have the whole nation tell Virginia you can or cannot have slavery. Let Virginia make that decision. This is also known as states' rights. So Ellsworth's reason is states have the right to do it themselves. All right, do you think that's a good reason? It's up to you. Go down to Mr. Williamson. Southern states could not be members of the Union if the slave trade ended. It is wrong to force anything that is not absolutely necessary and which any state must disagree to. All right, so Mr. Williamson isn't saying anything new there. He's saying it's wrong for this big government to tell states what to do. The South is not going to be part of the country if the slave trade ends. It's a bad idea. All right, so nothing really to add there. Let's go down to what Benjamin Franklin has to say. Benjamin Franklin wrote, I agree to this Constitution with all of its faults because I think a federal national government necessary for us. When you assemble a large group of men, you will inevitably find that they will disagree with each other about their local interests and their selfish views. We have to accept some of the disagreements in order to build a national government. Okay, a couple things. One, there's some great, well, really, there's just one I really want to focus on. That word inevitably. That's a great vocabulary word. If something is inevitable, that means it's going to happen no matter what. It doesn't matter what you do, it will happen. So what Franklin is saying at the very beginning is, I recognize that this Constitution has faults. It's not perfect. But it's more important to Ben Franklin that we have a national government rather than ending slavery. He sees that as more important. Okay, that's his argument. It's probably the best argument they have because Franklin is saying, look, we got to start something here. We're starting a new nation. It's important to start that new nation, and we can talk about slavery later. I'm not saying it's a great argument, but I think it's the best argument they have. He goes on to say men are inevitably going to disagree with each other. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, people can't agree on sports teams, politics, or what to get for lunch. So, I mean, Franklin's not saying anything crazy there. He says we have to accept these disagreements in order to build a national government. Okay, so Franklin's argument was it's more important to accept this Constitution as imperfect as it is and start a new national government than end slavery. So those are the viewpoints of the Founding Fathers. Those are their arguments. What do you think of them? Are they good arguments? Are they bad arguments? If you think they're good arguments, tell me why in your answer. If you think they're not such great arguments, tell me why they're not in your answer. Include some of this in your answer. Some of you have been writing stuff and it's just like kind of whatever you think, but it's not. I'm not saying you're unintelligent. You are intelligent, but you're making decisions without using the source, if that makes sense. It's like you can be a great athlete, but if I haven't taught you how to play the game, you're not going to play the game well. Here, I'm teaching you about the thing. I've given you 4 different points of view. Use those points of view in your answer. So you might say, hey, Mr. Ellsworth says this. I think it's a good opinion because blah, blah, blah. Or Mr. Williams says this. I think it's not a great opinion because whatever. It's up to you. All right? So do that in your answer. I think it's really important that you include that, and I'll include that in the assignment. Go down to where it says historian interpretations. So those were all primary sources because they were from the Constitutional Convention when this was decided. These historian interpretations are all from 1995, 1987, and again, 1987 respectively. So they all happened hundreds of years after the Constitutional Convention. So let's see what these historians had to say about keeping slavery in the Constitution and why the Founding Fathers did it. Historian interpretation number 1, John P. Kaminsky from A Necessary Evil, 1995. The men at the Constitutional Convention never considered getting rid of slavery. The revolutionary talk of freedom and equality had been left behind. Americans in general, and the men at the convention in particular, wanted a united, well-ordered, and prosperous society in which private property, including slave property, would be secure. So Kaminsky, the first historian, his argument is they were never going to get rid of slavery, the Founding Fathers. All the Founding Fathers were interested in was setting up a government, a society in which all property was protected, and that included slaves. You have to remember, slaves were considered property. They weren't considered human beings, even though they were, and they should have been. They were considered property, human property. So Kaminsky says the Founding Fathers never thought about it. This was 100% done to protect their own property. Okay. Historian number 2, William Freeling from the Founding Fathers and Slavery, 1987. The Founding Fathers' racism was a barrier to anti-slavery. Here again, Jefferson typified the age. That meant he was typical of the moment. Jefferson suspected that blacks had lower intellectual abilities than did whites. These suspicions, together with Jefferson's fear that free blacks and free whites could not live harmoniously in America, made him and others think that the only way Africans could be free was if they were sent back to Africa. Ooh, okay. Not very flattering of the Founding Fathers, Freeling's take is. Basically, they're saying, Freeling says, look, the Founding Fathers were racist. They're racist. They think black people need to be enslaved because if they're not enslaved, they'll run wild if they're free. They can't live harmoniously with white people. And so if you're not going to have them be slaves, you can't have them live here. They got to go back to Africa. I mean, if the Founding Fathers believed that, and I think a lot of them did, that's a very, very racist portrayal. It's a very, very racist belief. So what do you think? Do you think Freeling is right about it? Why? Tell me why. Last one, Kermit Hall from The Law of American Slavery, 1987. Slavery hung over the Philadelphia Convention, threatening to divide northern and southern delegates. Even though slavery existed by law in some of the northern states in 1787, most people there favored its end. Southerners were more unsure about whether to end slavery, both because they had significantly greater numbers of slaves to deal with, and because an end to slavery had important economic implications. The result was compromise. The Founding Fathers were more determined to fashion a new nation than they were to bring an end to slavery. Okay, so what this historian says is, yeah, most of the North wanted to get rid of slavery. Southerners, while they wanted to keep it a little more, they were unsure. They were sort of worried about how it would affect them economically in the sense that slaves actually made money for the plantation owners in the South. But ultimately, this third historian sounds a lot like Ben Franklin, where he says, if you read the last sentence, the Founding Fathers were more determined to fashion a new nation than they were to bring an end to slavery. In other words, he's saying, well, they're not really racist. They're just trying to get this new nation started. Okay, so not all of the opinions are the same. You have 4 Founding Fathers telling you what they think, and sometimes they cross over, and then you have 3 historians telling you what they think. So what I want you to do is consider all of those perspectives and then tell me, why did the Founding Fathers leave slavery in the Constitution? And I want you to reference at least 2 of the Founding Fathers and at least 2 of the historians in your answer. That gives your answer legitimacy because you're going to the source and you're saying, hey, these experts and these people who were there, this is what they think. Well, here's what I think on top of that. It's a great way to make an argument. It's a great way to write a paper. So that's what I want you to do. Now, if you're struggling with this and this doesn't make any sense to you, I guess I understand, but I would argue this is pretty straightforward. So if you're really struggling with this, I am going to have a Q&A on Friday, and I'll put the Zoom code on Google Classroom. And make sure that when you come into Zoom, you put your name, first name, last name, so that I know who's coming in, because I've had some students in the waiting room and they have inappropriate names. And if you have an inappropriate name, or if I don't recognize your name, I'm not letting you in for the Q&A. The Q&A is optional. You don't have to do it. It's just if you want additional help and this video you feel like hasn't helped you enough. So I'll gladly help you, but you've got to show me your name on Zoom, and I'll gladly help you for that. So this will be due next week. I think this is fairly straightforward. I think you can give me a great answer in about 14 to 17 sentences. I don't think that's crazy. And by the way, these sentences are guidelines. If you have 13 sentences and it's an awesome answer, I'm not going to be like, oh, it was 13 sentences, I said 14. I'm not going to bust your chops for that. But, you can't answer this in 5 sentences. You just can't. You can't do it in 7 or 8 sentences. So just try to get as much as you can. Get to the point. Use these things. Don't just copy and paste. A smart thing to do would be to take something that they say, hey, according to historian number 3, whatever his name, Kermit Hall, according to Mr. Ellsworth, Mr. Rutledge, quote them, and then when you're done with the quote, say, hey, this is what they mean, and this is what I think about it. That's how you give a good answer, okay? So I'll be there at the Q&A if you need any help. Our question is, why did the Founding Fathers leave slavery in the Constitution? I think you'll do a good job with this, and I look forward to reading your answers.